Jack Dusty Miller had always considered himself a man of the open range. Raised on a dusty ranch surrounded by wide plains and rough, unforgiving landscapes, he was used to facing challenges head-on. He wasn't the sort to shy away from danger or hardship, but as he rode through the desert that day, he felt more alone than he ever had before. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the wind carried a dry, hot dust that made his throat feel like it was filled with sand. It had all started a few weeks earlier. Jack had been part of a small cattle ranch, one that had been struggling to make ends meet for years. The land was tough and the cattle weren't as healthy as they should have been. Jack did his best to keep things going, but one fateful day a disagreement with a neighboring rancher turned into a heated argument. Things got ugly fast. Words were exchanged, threats made, and before Jack knew it, a gun had been drawn. The situation escalated until Jack had no choice but to leave. He wasn't about to let things get any worse, so he packed up what little he could carry and rode off without looking back. He didn't have a clear plan, but Jack knew he had to get away. He couldn't stay in the town where everyone knew him, where his name had been tied to that ugly argument. The only place he could think to go was the desert, the one place where he could truly disappear. For days, Jack rode through the vast emptiness of the desert, hoping to find some shelter or water. But the desert is a cruel place and it doesn't forgive mistakes or offer any comfort. His horse, an old mare named Bella, was starting to tire. Dusty knew that if he didn't find a place to rest soon, both he and Bella would be in serious trouble. The heat was unbearable, and the only sound was the occasional breeze blowing across the dry, cracked earth. Jack's face was covered in sweat, and his lips were cracked from the lack of water. His body ached from days of riding and his mind began to wander. He thought about his family, his old life on the ranch, and the friends he'd left behind. But most of all, he thought about the cowboy life he'd always known, a life that had now slipped away from him. Just as he was starting to lose hope, he spotted something up ahead, a small patch of green in the middle of the desert. It looked like an oasis, and Jack's heart leaped with hope. He spurred Bella forward, urging her on as fast as the old mare could go. The sight of that green patch, a small grove of trees and some brush, was enough to keep him going. As he drew closer, he saw a small structure hidden among the trees. It wasn't much, a hut of some sort, but it was a shelter. Jack didn't hesitate. He urged Bella towards it, desperate for a place to rest. When he reached the shelter, Jack dismounted, his legs stiff from the long ride. He tied Bella to a nearby tree and approached the small hut. It seemed empty, the door slightly ajar. Jack pushed it open cautiously, unsure of what he might find inside. The dim light inside revealed a simple, modest interior. There was a small cot, a table, and some crude wooden shelves lined with supplies. It didn't look like a home that belonged to anyone important, and Jack, exhausted and desperate, thought he had stumbled upon a temporary refuge. The idea of a few hours of sleep was more than enough to convince him that this was a safe place. Without giving it much thought, Jack made himself comfortable. He stretched out on the cot, removing his boots and loosening his shirt. He closed his eyes for just a moment, telling himself that he would be fine. He wasn't sure where he was, but in that moment it didn't matter. All he needed was rest, and he planned to sleep as long as the sun allowed him. But as he lay there, a sense of unease began to creep into his thoughts. It was too quiet, and the stillness of the desert seemed to press in on him. Jack opened one eye and glanced around the hut. It didn't seem right. There were markings on the walls, symbols carved into the wood. He didn't know much about Native American culture, but he knew enough to recognize these signs as belonging to the Apache people. The thought crossed his mind that he might have made a mistake by entering someone's home, but the weariness of the journey clouded his judgment. Just as he began to drift off, a noise at the door caught his attention. Jack quickly sat up, his instincts kicking in. He reached for the knife strapped to his belt just in case. The door creaked open slowly and a tall figure stepped inside. Jack's hand tightened on the hilt of his knife, ready for whatever might come next. But when the figure stepped fully into the hut, his grip loosened. Standing before him was a woman, young, beautiful, and unarmed. She was dressed in traditional Apache clothing, her long black hair tied back in a braid, her eyes, dark and intense, locked onto his. There was no fear in her gaze, only curiosity and a quiet strength that sent a chill through Jack. He had seen many strong women in his life, but none like this. Her presence was commanding, as if she was someone who could silence the world with a single glance. Jack stood up slowly, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to being caught off guard, but this was different. This wasn't just a random person. This was someone who belonged to the land. Someone who could likely end his life with ease if she chose. His first instinct was to apologize, to explain that he didn't mean any harm, but before he could speak, she raised her hand to stop him. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady but cold. Her words were sharp, yet there was something about the way she spoke that made Jack pause. He wasn't sure if she was angry or simply intrigued by his presence. "My name's Jack." "Jack Miller," he replied, keeping his voice as calm as he could. "I didn't mean to intrude. I've been lost in the desert for days. I just needed a place to rest." The woman studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "This is not a place for strangers," she said quietly. "You should leave." Jack felt a knot form in his stomach. He realized that he had made a mistake, but he was too tired to leave now. The woman seemed to sense this, her gaze softening slightly. "You've come a long way," she said. "I'll allow you to stay for a short time, but you must be gone by morning." Jack nodded, grateful for her mercy, though he still felt the weight of his mistake. He didn't know who this woman was, but there was something about her that made him think twice. There was a certain strength in her that he had only seen in the toughest men he knew. As he sat back down, Jack couldn't help but wonder about the shelter and the woman. Who was she, and why did she seem so familiar with the land? Was she a part of a tribe, and if so, which one? And why had she allowed him to stay when she clearly didn't trust him? Little did Jack know, this was only the beginning of a much deeper story, one that would change his life forever. The woman stood there for a moment, her gaze unwavering as she observed Jack with sharp eyes. Jack could feel the tension in the air, and for a brief second he thought she might ask him to leave right away, but instead, she simply nodded towards the small fire that burned near the entrance of the shelter, a low flame flickering in the evening breeze. "Sit," she said softly, her voice firm but not unkind. It wasn't a request. It was more of a command, and Jack instinctively obeyed, though he was still unsure of who this woman was or why she seemed so calm in the face of a stranger's intrusion. Jack lowered himself to the ground near the fire, watching her as she moved gracefully around the shelter. She didn't seem afraid of him, which confused him even more. Most people, especially women, would be nervous about having an armed stranger in their home. But this woman, who Jack now realized was probably in her early 20s, didn't show a hint of fear. It was almost as if she expected him, as if she had known he would arrive. She didn't speak as she worked, gathering some herbs and placing them carefully in a small bowl. Jack watched her silently, trying to make sense of the situation. There was something about her calmness that made him feel out of place. His rugged cowboy nature felt so out of tune with the quiet rhythm of this world. Everything around him was foreign, yet strangely familiar. The way she moved with confidence and purpose reminded him of the quiet strength he had often seen in the land itself. There was no hesitation in her steps. She knew exactly what she was doing. After a few minutes, she turned to face him, her expression still unreadable. Jack shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say next. He had no idea how to start a conversation with someone who seemed so different from anyone he had ever met. His mind raced for something to say, anything to break the silence. I'm not a troublemaker," Jack began, trying to sound casual. "I just got lost out there in the desert. My horse is tired, and I didn't know where else to go." The woman didn't respond immediately. She simply tilted her head slightly as though studying him. Jack had the feeling she could see through his words, that she could tell he wasn't telling the whole truth. But then, after a long pause, she nodded, almost as if accepting his explanation. "I know," she said softly, her voice carrying a strange mixture of understanding and mystery. "You are not the first to wander here. The desert takes many people." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in the way she spoke, something ancient and wise that made him wonder just how much she knew about the desert. And about him. Her words hung in the air, but Jack didn't know how to respond. He was beginning to feel that he had walked into something much bigger than he had realized. The world around him, the simple shelter, the fire, the quiet, seemed so different from his life on the ranch. It was as though he had crossed into another world, a world where the rules were different, and he was an outsider, For a moment, they simply sat there in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. Jack watched her, trying to figure her out. Her eyes were dark, but not in a way that felt cold. There was an intensity to them, a deep, quiet strength that made him feel as if she carried the weight of many lifetimes in her gaze. Her hair, long and black, cascaded over her shoulders in a way that made her look like she belonged to the land itself, as though she were part of the very desert they sat in. Jack shifted again, uncomfortable under the weight of her silent observation. He had never been one to sit around and wait. He was used to moving, working, doing something with his hands. But here, in the shelter, the stillness pressed in on him, and he wasn't sure how to fill the space between them. "What's your name?" Jack finally asked, unable to stand the silence any longer. She looked at him for a long moment before answering, as though deciding how much to reveal. Her lips parted and she spoke softly, but there was strength in her words. "Ayanna," she said simply. "I am Ayanna." Jack nodded slowly, repeating the name in his mind. He wasn't familiar with it, but there was something about the way she said it with such quiet confidence that made him feel like it carried meaning. It wasn't just a name. It was a symbol of who she was, a part of her identity, something that couldn't be easily understood by someone like him. Ayanna didn't say anything more about herself. Instead, she reached for a leather pouch that hung at her waist, pulling out some dried herbs. She crushed them gently in her hands, releasing a pleasant fragrance that filled the small shelter. As she worked, Jack watched her closely, curious about what she was doing but not wanting to interrupt. "I need to rest," he said eventually, breaking the silence once more. His exhaustion was starting to catch up with him, and he didn't want to make any more of a nuisance of himself than he already had. "I'll be gone at first light. Just need a few hours of sleep." Ayanna glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. "Rest," she said simply. "But understand this. There are many things in this world you do not yet know. The desert, the people, the land itself, all of it is connected in ways that are beyond your understanding." Jack didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't sure if she was talking about him, about the desert, or about something else entirely. But her words stuck with him, sinking deep into his mind. It was as though she had just opened a door to something he couldn't quite see, a mystery that called to him but remained just out of reach. For the rest of the evening, Ayanna said little. She seemed content to work quietly, her movements fluid and purposeful. Jack, on the other hand, tried to get comfortable on the cot, but sleep eluded him. His mind kept racing with questions about Ayanna, about the desert, about everything that had brought him here. He found himself thinking about her quiet strength, the way she moved with such assurance. She wasn't like the women he knew back home, women who were content to stay within the boundaries of society's expectations. Ayanna seemed to belong to something bigger, something ancient and wild. It was as if she were a part of the land itself, connected to the earth in ways Jack couldn't comprehend. By the time the fire had burned low, Jack had finally drifted into a light sleep, but his dreams were filled with strange visions of deserts and distant voices. In the morning, he knew he would leave, but part of him felt reluctant. There was something about this place, about Ayanna, that drew him in, something that he couldn't quite explain, and despite everything, he knew that he had only just begun to scratch the surface of the story that was unfolding around him. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert. The warmth of the day slowly gave way to the cooler evening air. Jack lay on the cot, his thoughts swirling around the strange woman who had offered him shelter. He tried to make sense of everything, but it was hard to focus. Ayanna's presence lingered in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was more than just a woman living in a remote desert shelter. There was something about her, something powerful and mysterious that made him feel like an outsider, like he didn't belong in this place. As he lay there trying to sleep, Jack couldn't help but listen to the sounds of the desert night. The wind whispered through the trees outside, carrying with it the distant cries of animals in the distance. It was a sound he had heard many times before, but tonight it seemed different. Tonight it felt like the land itself was alive, breathing, watching. He turned over restlessly on the cot. It wasn't the first time in his life that he had slept in the wilderness, but something about the quiet of the night here felt unsettling. Maybe it was the way Ayanna had spoken earlier, her words about the desert being full of things Jack couldn't understand. Or maybe it was the way she moved, so sure of herself, so connected to this place. Eventually, Jack drifted into a light sleep, But his dreams were troubled. He dreamed of vast deserts stretching on forever, of winds that howled like wolves, and of voices that called to him from far away. There was no clear shape to the dreams, only shadows and whispers, a sense of something just out of reach. When he awoke, it was still dark, but he could feel the coldness of the night settling in. The fire in the shelter had burned low and only faint embers remained. Ayanna was already up, sitting by the fire, staring into the dying flames. Jack watched her for a moment before standing up quietly. He didn't want to disturb her, but he felt a strange pull to speak with her again. It had been a long night and he needed answers. Questions had been building inside him since the moment he had entered the shelter, and now he needed to ask. He approached her cautiously, unsure of how to begin. She didn't look at him immediately, but her presence seemed to fill the room. She was sitting with her back straight, as if she was listening to something only she could hear. Her hair, braided neatly, swayed slightly with the breeze that entered through the small opening of the shelter. The firelight danced across her face, casting shadows that made her look both fierce and calm at once. Finally, Jack spoke. "Why did you let me stay?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. It was a question that had been nagging at him ever since he had arrived. Why had she allowed a stranger into her shelter? What was her reason for offering him kindness when he had no right to be there? Ayanna turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. There was no anger in her gaze, just a quiet intensity that made Jack feel like she could see straight through him. She paused for a moment before speaking, her voice soft but firm. "I could feel your weariness," she said. "The desert takes many, and I could see that you had been lost for a long time. It is not kindness that I offered. It is simply what the land requires." Her words were simple, but Jack could tell that there was more behind them than she was letting on. The land requires? What did she mean by that? Jack opened his mouth to ask, but before he could, Ayanna stood up and began to gather the last of the herbs from her table. She moved quickly, almost as if she had somewhere to be. Jack watched her, waiting for her to explain further, but she didn't seem eager to talk. He hesitated, unsure of what to do. He had always been a man of action, not words, but this felt different. The more he learned about Ayanna, the more he realized that he wasn't dealing with just any woman. She wasn't like the women back home, who had simple lives defined by ranching and families. Ayanna's life seemed to be shaped by something older, something bigger than the ordinary struggles of daily life. After a moment, Ayanna spoke again, her voice calm but insistent. "I don't stay here to escape my past," she said, her words carrying a weight that Jack hadn't expected. "I stay here because I need to find my way. My father is a chief. He believes in the old ways, the ways of power, strength, and war. But I do not. I do not believe in the violence he brings. I want peace. I want a life that is free, that does not tie me to the burden of leadership." Jack's heart quickened. This was the first time Ayanna had opened up about her past, and it felt like she was giving him a glimpse into a world he could barely understand. She was the daughter of a chief, and she didn't believe in the ways of her people. She paused, her eyes dark with unspoken thoughts. "My father expects me to follow in his footsteps," she continued, her voice quiet now. "He wants me to become the leader of our tribe. But I cannot. I cannot lead with blood on my hands. I cannot be a part of the war he wages against our enemies." Jack listened, trying to make sense of everything she was saying. He had no idea what life was like for someone like Ayanna. The cowboy life he had known had been tough, but it had never involved the kind of responsibility that Ayanna seemed to carry. She was not just a woman in the desert. She was a symbol of something much larger, a piece of a world that Jack knew nothing about. "I understand," Jack said, though he wasn't sure if he truly did. He had never been in her shoes, never felt the pressure of carrying a tribe's future on his shoulders. But he could sense the weight in her voice, the burden of expectations that hung over her like a dark cloud. Ayanna looked at him, her eyes softening just slightly. "No, you do not understand, and that is why you will leave in the morning, as you said you would. The world I live in is not for you, Jack Miller. The path I walk is mine alone." Jack stood silently, feeling the truth of her words settle into his bones. There was no easy way to explain the differences between their worlds, no simple way to bridge the gap between the life of a cowboy and the life of a woman bound by ancient traditions. He had always been a loner, but Ayanna's world was different. It wasn't about surviving alone in the desert. It was about finding peace and making choices that were bigger than oneself. I will leave in the morning, Jack said finally, his voice steady. But I will never forget what you've shared with me tonight. Ayanna gave him a small nod, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Good, she said. And remember, Jack Miller, the desert is not just a place. It is a way of life. It shapes those who live within it. It shapes me. And it will shape you too in ways you cannot yet understand. The fire crackled as Ayanna turned away, her figure silhouetted against the flames. Jack watched her, feeling both a sense of respect and confusion. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that his time with Ayanna had opened a door to something he never could have imagined. As the night grew darker, Jack lay down on the cot once more, knowing that by morning he would be on his way. But the desert and Ayanna had already begun to leave their mark on him. The first light of dawn crept slowly into the shelter, its warm rays pushing away the cold shadows of the night. Jack stirred on the cot, blinking his eyes open. For a moment, everything felt quiet and peaceful, almost like a dream. The sounds of the desert night had faded, replaced by the soft morning breeze rustling the leaves outside. Bella, his horse, was quietly grazing nearby, just outside the shelter. Jack felt a strange reluctance to leave, even though he had told Ayanna he would be gone by sunrise. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes and stretching his sore muscles. His journey, both physically and mentally, had been exhausting. The desert had drained him, but the time he had spent with Ayanna had stirred something in him that he hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of curiosity, a desire to understand a way of life that was so different from his own. Ayanna had already woken up before him, as Jack could see her silhouette moving near the small fire. The embers still glowed faintly, casting a soft light across the shelter. She didn't seem surprised to see him awake. In fact, she didn't seem to notice much at all as she moved about, preparing something Jack couldn't quite see. Jack stood up and walked towards the fire, hoping for a last chance to talk to her before he left. He felt like there was something important he still didn't understand, something he needed to ask. Ayanna, he called out softly, not wanting to startle her. I'll be on my way soon, but I wanted to say, thank you for everything. She paused, her back still turned to him. For a brief moment, Jack thought she wouldn't answer, but then she spoke in her calm, measured tone. You have learned nothing about me, Jack Miller, she said quietly, and yet you think you understand me. You think you know why I let you stay here? Jack opened his mouth to speak, but she raised her hand to stop him. She turned toward him slowly, her eyes looking at him with a mixture of something Jack couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was weariness. Perhaps something deeper. I didn't let you stay out of kindness, Ayanna continued, her voice steady but full of meaning. I allowed you to stay because the desert is not kind, and because you came here lost and broken. I could have turned you away, but I chose not to. Why? She paused, her gaze fixed on Jack's, and for a moment, he felt like she was reading his very soul. Because the desert doesn't give its mercy easily. It chooses who survives. Jack was taken aback. He hadn't expected such an intense response, but he couldn't deny the truth in her words. The desert had shown him no mercy. It had been a struggle, a fight for every drop of water and every moment of shade. And yet here he was, alive and well enough to leave. Perhaps he had been given mercy, but he hadn't truly earned it. Before Jack could respond, Ayanna turned back to the fire, pulling a small pot closer and stirring something inside it. The smell of herbs and something earthy filled the air. Jack watched her in silence, unsure of what to say. She seemed so connected to the land, so certain of her place in it, and he felt small in comparison. You're right about one thing, Jack finally said, breaking the silence. I don't know anything about you or the life you lead, but I'm starting to understand that I don't have to. I don't need to know everything. I've seen something here that I haven't seen in a long time. Peace. Something you have with this land that I'll never have. He paused, trying to find the right words. You live a life that's different from mine, but there's something in the way you live it. Something I can't explain. Ayanna didn't reply immediately. She kept working, her hands moving with practiced ease. The quiet between them was not uncomfortable but heavy, filled with the weight of everything they hadn't said. Jack turned to leave, but as he stepped toward the door of the shelter, Ayanna's voice stopped him. You will leave, she said, her voice soft but firm. But the desert will always be a part of you. Whether you like it or not, you will carry it with you. It will shape you as it shapes everyone who steps into it. Jack glanced back at her, trying to find the right words. But before he could speak, Ayana turned away from him, her focus on the task in front of her. Jack wasn't sure if she had said what she did out of duty, or out of some deeper understanding of what he needed to hear. Either way, her words struck him in a way that left him thinking long after he had stepped outside. The air outside felt cooler than it had the day before, the sun just beginning to rise fully above the horizon. Jack walked over to Bella, who greeted him with a soft nicker as he untied her from the tree. He felt a strange pull in his chest as he prepared to leave, but he couldn't stay. The desert was calling him just as it had before. It was his way of life, and he had no choice but to answer it. As he saddled Bella, Jack thought about Ayana's words. The desert would always be a part of him. He had no idea what she meant by that, but there was truth in it. The desert had already shaped him in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. The long hours under the blazing sun, the loneliness, the struggle, it had all left its mark. And as much as he wanted to leave it behind, a part of him knew that he would never be able to escape it. Ayana appeared at the edge of the shelter, watching him silently. Jack didn't know if she was waiting for him to say something more or if she simply wanted to make sure he left. Either way, he didn't have the words to explain everything he was feeling. "I'll remember what you said," Jack said, finally breaking the silence. He didn't know if it was the right thing to say, but it felt like the truth. Ayana gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. There was no smile, no farewell. Just the quiet understanding between them, a shared knowledge that words weren't necessary. Jack mounted Bella and began to ride away, his heart heavy with a mix of emotions he didn't fully understand. He had come to the desert looking for a place to hide, to escape his past. But now, as he rode away from Ayana and the shelter, he realized that the desert had given him something much more important: understanding. It had shown him that sometimes survival isn't just about making it through the next day. It's about finding a way to live in harmony with the world around you, even when the world is as harsh as the desert. As Jack rode off into the distance, he couldn't help but feel that Ayana's world and his own had crossed in a way that would never truly be undone. The desert and Ayana had left their mark on him, and though he couldn't yet see it clearly, he knew that this journey had changed him in ways that would unfold over time. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Jack rode steadily through the desert. Bella, his loyal horse, moved at a slow but steady pace, her hooves crunching on the dry ground with each step. The landscape stretched out before him, vast and endless, the same as it had been the day before and the day before that. But today something was different. Today, Jack could feel the weight of everything that had happened over the past few days. His encounter with Ayana, her quiet strength and her words had stayed with him like an unshakable weight on his mind. There was a sense of something unfinished, something he hadn't quite figured out. He wasn't sure if he was meant to stay in the desert, or if his life here had just been a brief moment of clarity in the midst of a long journey. But as the miles stretched on, Jack realized that the desert was no longer just a place to escape. It had become a part of him. The air was still hot, but it wasn't as harsh as it had been on the previous days. The wind seemed to whisper in the distance, carrying with it a quiet promise. It was as though the desert was trying to speak to him, offering him something he hadn't yet understood. Jack pulled his hat lower over his eyes to block out the sun, but it did little to shield him from the thoughts swirling in his mind. He had left Ayana behind, but in truth, he hadn't really left her at all. She had left an impression on him, one that couldn't be easily erased. Her life, her choices, the way she had lived in harmony with the desert, it was all so different from his own. And yet, in a way, it had felt familiar. Maybe it was the simplicity of it, or the quiet strength she carried with her. But whatever it was, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he had been a part of something important, something much bigger than he had realized. As Jack rode, he began to think about his life before the desert. The ranch, the cattle, the constant struggle to make ends meet. His life had always been defined by the need to survive. He had never really stopped to think about what he was surviving for. It had just been about getting through each day, fixing the fences, working the land, and moving on to the next challenge. But in the desert, it had been different. In the desert, Jack had found something he hadn't expected: peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from avoiding trouble or running away. It wasn't about escaping the past or forgetting what had happened. The peace Jack had found here was the kind that came from accepting the harshness of the world around him and learning to live with it. It was the kind of peace that Ayanna seemed to carry with her, a peace born from understanding the desert, from knowing that it wasn't just a place to endure, but a place to live with. Jack realized now that he had been running from something for a long time, not just the argument with the rancher, but from his own doubts and fears. He had always been a man of action, used to solving problems with his hands and his strength. But the desert had shown him that sometimes the answers weren't found in action. Sometimes the answers came from listening, from paying attention to the world around you, and from learning to live in balance with it. The journey had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. Ayanna had played a part in that change, though Jack wasn't sure if she realized it. She had opened his eyes to something new, a way of life that was different from his own but no less valuable. She had shown him that peace didn't come from control or dominance. It came from understanding, from finding your place in the world and accepting the land you were given. After several hours of riding, Jack began to notice something off in the distance. There, against the horizon, he could make out a figure, someone moving slowly across the desert. It was difficult to tell at first, but as he got closer, Jack saw that it was a lone rider riding toward him. His heart skipped a beat and 1,000 questions flooded his mind. Who could this be? Was it someone from the tribe? Or was it another traveler like himself? As the figure drew nearer, Jack saw that it was a man, riding a horse much like his own, moving steadily but without haste. When the man was close enough, Jack slowed Bella and came to a stop. The stranger did the same, his horse coming to a gentle halt beside Jack. The man was older than Jack, his face weathered and lined from years spent under the sun. His eyes, though, were sharp and clear, and there was a calm about him that reminded Jack of Ayanna. "You're out here alone," the man said, his voice deep and gravelly, like someone who had spent a lifetime in the desert. "You're brave, or maybe foolish. What's your name, traveler?" Jack nodded politely but didn't offer his hand. "Jack Miller," he said. "I've been riding through the desert." "Just passing through." The man looked him up and down as though sizing him up. Then he smiled, a small knowing smile. "You're not just passing through," he said softly. "The desert doesn't let you pass through. It holds on to you. It changes you." Jack didn't know how to respond. He had heard something similar before from Ayanna. The desert had already left its mark on him, he realized. It wasn't just the heat or the dry air. It was the way it made him think, the way it made him see the world differently. The man gave a slow nod, as if confirming something Jack hadn't fully understood until that moment. "You've learned that much already, I see," the man continued. "You're not the first to come here and find something you weren't looking for. The desert gives and it takes, but what it gives in silence. What it takes with time." Jack stared at the man, his words settling in. The desert had taken so much from him, his past, his doubts, his escape. But it had also given him something he hadn't expected, a sense of understanding. A sense of peace. Ayanna had been right. The desert shaped those who entered it, and it had shaped him in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. The man tipped his hat slightly, as if to acknowledge Jack's understanding, and then turned his horse. "Take care, Jack Miller," he called over his shoulder as he rode off into the horizon. "The desert will remember you." Jack watched him go, feeling a strange sense of finality. He wasn't sure if he would ever see the man again, but somehow it didn't matter. The desert had done its work. It had given Jack the peace he had been searching for, even if he hadn't known he needed it. And now, as he rode onward, he realized that his journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. The desert had changed him, and in some way he would always be connected to it. The peace he had found with Ayanna, the lessons he had learned from the land, and the quiet understanding that had settled within him, these things would stay with him. Wherever he went from here, he would carry the desert with him, and in doing so, he would always carry a part of Ayanna's world, a part of the life she had shared with him. As Jack rode off into the endless desert, he felt something that he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging. It wasn't to a place or a people, but to the journey itself, and he knew, deep down, that the desert and the quiet strength it had given him would guide him wherever he went.